Hello, everybody, and welcome to the 15th edition of the People Political Podcast. I'm Yashawn Pokrell.
My name's Cameron Cummings.
And today we are joined by the managing editor of Nonpartisan Political Analysis newsletter, Larry Sabato's Crystal Ball, Kyle Kondik. Welcome to the show, Kyle.
Thanks for having me.
So before we get into the more modern, or not modern, but more current conversation about your book and about some recent elections and other issues, tell listeners a little bit about yourself and how you got to this position that you're in.
Yeah, so I'm from Northeast Ohio. I went to Ohio University. I studied journalism there. I had a couple jobs in newspapers, Northeast Ohio, in the 2000s. My one job in politics, really government, was I worked for Richard Cordray, who was the Democratic Attorney General of Ohio for a couple of years, from basically 2008 to 2010. And so I was a speechwriter. I did some other stuff for him, and we ended up, he lost re-election to Mike DeWine. At the time was a former U.S. Senator. He then served 2 terms as Attorney General, is now the Governor of Ohio. And so after we lost, I had to find something else to do. And so I applied for the job down at the Center for Politics at UVA and ended up getting it. And I've been with the Center for Politics ever since. I spent my first couple years based in Charlottesville, and then I've been working remotely from Washington for the bulk of my time with the Center for Politics. So I do election analysis. I handle some communications jobs for the Center for Politics. I do a number of other things, and it's given me the opportunity to really learn more about politics, to write about politics, to think about politics, and I've got my master's since then. I turned my master's thesis into one of my 2 books. So I feel like I've had a pretty good run at Center for Politics. It's been a good job.
And you specialize in House elections, correct?
Yeah, I do a lot with House elections. My most recent book, The Long Red Thread, is a history of U.S. House elections since the 60s. And when I first started at the Center, that was sort of the group of races that I was sort of most responsible for, and I think that's probably still the case at the Center, although I am and always have been very involved in our ratings for U.S. Senate, for governor's races, and also for presidential races when we have them.
That's very good, very well-rounded there. Let's get into your book a little bit, because I did get to read it. Pretty good read. I recommend it to anybody who's interested in electoral history, especially in the shift from, like you said, from 1964 to present, as the title of your book is. We'll have a link to your book in the description as well.
Yeah.
But let's get into a little bit, there's one really fascinating thing in the first part of your book that I found really surprising, and I was talking to Cam about this before we started recording. So in the 60s and the 70s, and a little bit past that too, there were we have redistricting every 10 years because of the census. Legislatures would redistrict whenever they switched, they gained control in the state houses. So I didn't know this was a thing, and I was shocked by this, and you were talking about it. You were pretty shocked by it too, because now we just do every 10 years, and it seems pretty cut and dry now. But now everything's getting really polarized again. There's a lot of bickering partisanly. Do you think that this constant, this practice that kind of died out in the 20th century might come back here as politics becomes more partisan, even at a local level?
So there's nothing in federal law that prohibits districts from being redrawn really at any time. Now, there are certain states that have interpreted their own state constitutions to prohibit mid-decade redistricting. Probably the most famous example of sort of an elective mid-decade redistricting was Texas after the 2002 elections. Republicans had finally taken unified control of government in that state, and for a few decades, the Democrats had kind of kept control of the congressional delegation and also power in the state legislature in part through gerrymandering, but also because the parties were different back then. The Texas Democratic Party had a lot of conservatives in it, and so you would not call the governing majorities, for instance, in the Texas state legislature to be liberal the way we think of it now, or you wouldn't consider the U.S. House delegation from Texas to be from the Democratic side to be overwhelmingly liberal either. But so anyway, Republicans take control in 2002. They redraw the map to help themselves, and there was nothing illegal about that. I guess at the time, a lot of Democrats were outraged about it, which totally understand. But I think Republicans also probably had a right to be upset with the previous map, which was a court-drawn map that also was kind of modeled after previous Democratic gerrymanders. But if you go back the longer stretch of U.S. history, particularly in like the late 1800s, which also just like now was like a very competitive time in American politics. We had several really close presidential elections in a row. You had a few instances even of so-called electoral college misfires where the party that won the most votes did not actually win the presidency, which we're familiar with now. It happened in 2000 and 2016 to the benefit of the Republicans in both of those years. And in that time, there were some, mid-decade gerrymanders that probably had a decisive impact on control of the House. But then the early part of the 20th century, instead of there being gerrymanders all the time, a lot of states didn't even bother to change their lines. They didn't even really adjust for population, and that led to a lot of the population disparities between districts that animated the Supreme Court's decision to finally get involved in reapportionment, the landmark one person, one vote Supreme Court decisions in the early 60s that basically established a kind of regular every 10-year redistricting pattern. Some states would do that prior to those decisions, but not every state did. But that's how we have it now. But again, there are states this decade that are going to have different congressional maps. For instance, North Carolina that is under a court-imposed map. But that map basically sunsets starting next year. And if Republicans may have a friendlier state court in that state, so it might be that they're able to gerrymander. Ohio also has a really new convoluted system in which you probably will end up with having multiple congressional maps this decade. And again, if there's no prohibition in state law against frequent redistricting, you could hypothetically see it more often than just once a decade. But typically speaking, you just see it once a decade.
That's a little preview of Kyle's book, The Long Red Thread. We'll have a link to that to buy that in our description. Let's move on to a little bit more current.
So, like Yishang said, moving on to a little bit current. This is a little bit of a long one. So, with the discourse around House elections, which is normally pretty limited, and since one cycle is dominated by the presidential election and the other by the general lack of interest in midterm elections. Your June 22 piece for Sabatos. 27th.
Monday.
Sorry,
yeah.
That Monday, which was 2 days ago.
2 days ago.
3 days ago. 3 days ago from our recording date. Your June 27th piece from Sabatos Crystal Ball reaffirmed your belief that Republicans will retake the House this November, something which seemed likely for a good bit of time now. However, the noise around the recent overhaul of Roe v. Wade, in addition to the bipartisan gun bill, Safer Communities Act, have slightly muddied the waters a little bit. So it's been a little bit more of a coin toss than just a straightforward line. How much do you believe that these social issues will affect voters in November? And do you think more voters that are more blue will turn out to overflip, which seemed to be a straight line for Republicans to win the House?
I don't think that the gun legislation is going to have really any bearing on November at all. I think usually if the parties come together on something, I don't know if it necessarily has that much of an electoral effect. And you could honestly be cynical about it from a political perspective and say that potentially part of the reason that Mitch McConnell and some of the Senate Republicans went along with it was that, first of all, they didn't see it as being a particular problem, regarding the Second Amendment for them, but also they probably thought that, hey, if we do this, then maybe it takes the issue off the table for us in November and doesn't disrupt what we already thought was going to be a good midterm for our side. So I would set the gun issue aside. The abortion issue I think is more interesting and potentially more important, and I think we're still kind of sorting out what it may or may not mean for the fall. But it's one of the issues in American politics that I would say people are the most passionate about. I also frankly think the issue can be politically pretty toxic in that I think if people disagree on abortion, it's kind of hard to get them to agree on other things as well. And so we're just going to have to sort of wait and see how everything settles here. And it's not just going to settle in 2022. It's going to take years for for there to either be federal legislation dealing with abortion or the states obviously are going to take vastly different tracks on abortion. Some states are going to basically make it impossible to get abortions and make it illegal in effectively every instance. And some states are going to have essentially no restrictions on abortion. And then the question is that tenable? Do the states end up fighting each other on, trying to prosecute people for getting abortions over state lines? Like, there's all sorts of stuff here that is just going to be difficult to sort out. I will say that the Democrats, from a political perspective, definitely needed a shot in the arm, because I think this cycle is getting away from them, particularly in the House. And so potentially abortion maybe re-engages Democrats a little bit, brings some Democrats back in the fold who may have been wavering because of inflation, or they don't like Biden's performance, or this or that. Maybe it has an effect of bringing some folks home at the end. And I guess maybe you could say that sometimes happens in elections anyway. But perhaps that has some sort of effect in this particular election. And so, look, I mean, Roe v. Wade. I mean, if you ask Americans, like, just off the top of their head, to name a single Supreme Court decision, to the extent that anyone can, Roe v. Wade is probably the one that people would be able to recognize, because it's probably the most famous and impactful Supreme Court decision of the last half century, and now it's gone. And so there are definitely ramifications for that, both in the short term and the long term. But ultimately, given that the Republicans need to make such a small gain in the House and the numbers for them look so good, I still think the the Republicans are in really good shape to win the House. But the Senate has been trickier this whole time, and I think this may make the Senate even more competitive than it's been.
Yeah, so I feel like we've started to see a little bit of how voters respond to the Roe decision. In this Nebraska's first, they had a special election on the 28th, so last Tuesday. It's 2 state senators. I believe the representative was on probation because he lied to the FBI. So pretty strange district. I don't know what's going on over there, but it's in Nebraska. State Senator Mike Flood from the Republicans beat State Senator Patty Pansing Brooks by 6 points, but President Trump carried the district by 11 points in 2020. President Biden, very low approval rating, so there's not really much. I feel like there wasn't much influence from his policies in this election. So do you see this, even though Republicans won, it was much closer than, it was half the deficit of what they won in 2020 by President Trump. So do you think that this is a little bit of the beginning of a potential change in voter dynamics because of Roe v. Wade and really anything else?
It could be. I wouldn't necessarily put too much stock in a single special election. Special elections taken together can sometimes tell us something about the trend. I'd say generally speaking, the special election's been better for Republicans than Democrats, although it hasn't been as striking this cycle as it was in favor of Democrats during the 2018 cycle, where you had Democrats routinely, much overperforming, then Hillary Clinton's presidential performance from 2016 in those special elections. A few weeks ago, the Republicans were able to win a U.S. House seat in South Texas. They ended up running reasonably ahead of how Trump had done in that district, and that's a district that also trended pretty strongly Republican from 2016 to 2020 at the presidential level. And yet this is different. It sort of went the other way. The heart of Nebraska 1 is basically Lincoln, Nebraska, the state capital, and also where the flagship University of Nebraska campus is. And that's a lot of places like that, kind of more highly educated, college town, state capital, that sort of thing. Those kinds of places have been sort of trending Democratic over time. And, so we saw that the turnout was pretty good there, and also Pansing Brooks ran ahead of Biden in that county. Now the rest of the district is much more Republican leaning, and definitely was that way in the special election. And so it's possible that if you're going to see an abortion effect, I think you probably see it maybe in those kinds of places, particularly like Lancaster County in Nebraska, where Lincoln is, you might if we had the Texas race, yes, a couple days ago, maybe you wouldn't have seen that much of an effect because it may be that abortion is not the kind of animating issue for in like working class Hispanic districts compared to districts that have that are kind of more have higher levels of formal education, et cetera. So there might be sort of a disparate impact. And look, we don't know. I mean, maybe absent Roe, the result would have been the same. It's hard to really know. Certainly, there was very little interest in this election, and the outside groups on the Republican and Democratic side did not get involved, and so maybe it kind of snuck under the radar a little bit. So, again, a lot to unpack there, but it is an interesting result, and it was one that was sort of different than what we had seen in some other places where the metrics, I think, were much more positive for Republicans. So I wouldn't read too much into it, but, sometimes it takes a little while to start a trend, and maybe this is the start of a trend.
Yeah, like the 5-point swing. I mean, it's not like maybe it's an outlier, but also it's a pretty big swing. And like you said, turnout was
almost half of it.
Yeah, turnout was pretty high, especially considering 2020. I mean, obviously turnout was huge compared to recent elections across the board, and the fact that this saw a little bit of a cut into that lead for Democrats is very interesting. I know you have some questions about independent voting, so.
So really, another pretty decently long one. So the basics, pretty much of Democrats and Republicans are pretty fixed. The key votes in every election is the independents, the people that are still kind of down the middle that need to be swayed either left or right. And a group that has grown in numbers in recent years is both parties have shifted further from the center, at least in rhetoric. How do you think independents vote, and does the renewed appetite for social activism, especially with the Roe decision, give Democrats a chance with them
compared to the economic turmoil we see?
Yes,
that too. Yeah.
Because that's where a lot of people are leaning.
If the Democrats are going to do okay in this election, they're going to have to substantially run ahead of Joe Biden's approval, because the trend line for Biden's approval is just really bad, and it's been pretty consistent in that it's been declining since last summer, and it turned net negative around the time of the collapse of the U.S.-backed Afghan government and our withdrawal from kind of hasty withdrawal from Afghanistan, and which I don't think people necessarily care about now, but I think it sort of made a negative impression on people's conception of Biden's, or perception of Biden's competence, the competence of his administration. Again, the numbers have just gotten worse and worse, and so it seems like every day Biden is setting some sort of new low in the real clear politics and 538 approval average. He's consistently under 40 now, and his disapproval has moved over 55%. And so you would generally think that generally what that means is that, okay, so Democrats approve of Biden but don't approve of him unanimously. Republicans almost unanimously disapprove of Biden, which is what you'd expect for any sort of party of the other, or president of the other party. And then independents have a pretty negative view of Biden. And so for Democrats, it's how do you get those Biden skeptical independents to vote Democratic, and that shows the importance of making an election a choice as opposed to a referendum, which you hear all the time in midterms. And it's pretty hard for the president's party to actually do that. Midterms are often referendums, and frankly, I think this one probably will be too. But the abortion decision and the fallout from that may be a way for Democrats to make this more of a choice. In terms of independents, a lot of people who are independents are basically lying. They have some sort of actual connection to two parties, or they're a consistent voter for one side or the other. But the mix of independents who actually turn out, sometimes it's a more right-leaning mix, sometimes it's a more left-leaning mix, and also there are people who change their votes from election to election. There are Biden voters who are going to vote Republican or there were Biden voters who voted Republican down the ballot in 2020, and people do shift. Oftentimes, independents, though, are the people who pay the least amount of attention to things. That the hard partisans are the ones that are really paying a ton of attention to, the January 6th hearings and that sort of thing. But abortion is such a huge issue and the doing away with Roe V Wade is such a big deal that I think that that's the sort of thing that does reach basically every American in some way. And then it's a question as to how they react to it. Do they show up to vote? Who they vote for? Et cetera. But, the Democrats, I think, politically were in need of some sort of lifeline. And again, this may be it, or it may be it in certain races.
So to lead off that, How do you view the actions of House Democrat leaders such as Speaker Nancy Pelosi and Majority Whip Jim Clyburn, who heavily campaigned, for Representative Henry Cuellar, thank you. I was just about to ask for help on that one. Of Texas, which is 28th, Texas is 28th, one of the only pro-life Democrats in Congress.
I think now he's actually the only pro-life Democrat in Congress. I think the other one just retired. I looked it up. The research.
I think you're right about that. And there have been a handful of others, like Dan Lipinski from Illinois lost his primary last time. I think Colin Peterson probably fell into that camp. Long-serving Democrat from Minnesota. He also he was defeated in 2020. He was a real outlier in that he held like a 30-point Trump district.
Yeah. So he's now one of the only pro-life Democrats in Congress, while just recently sending out mass fundraising emails and video messages decrying the Dobbs v. Jackson decision. Do you see these types of contradictions as a reason for the national mood around Democrats souring the past few months and people kind of being turned off from that?
I think what Pelosi and Clyburn did in supporting Cuellar makes perfect sense, politically speaking. The Democrats in particular, I think, have to be a big tent party. I think historically they have been. Now, the old Democratic Party from the middle of the 20th century was such a big tent that it could accommodate basically the most conservative and, frankly, I would say backwards, particularly on racial matters, people, Southern members, and then also the kind of most progressive people in Congress too were also Democrats. So you could have, Richard Russell from Georgia and Hubert Humphrey in the same Senate caucus, and it was just that was just how it was. The Republicans were also more ideologically diverse back then, but probably not as dramatically of a big tent as the Democratic Party used to be. And over time, this has all gotten ideologically sorted out. The parties are both much more ideologically cohesive than they used to be, but for all of the whining and complaining from Democrats about Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema and, we should kick Manchin out of the party and blah, blah, blah. It's like, well, do you want the Republicans to have the majority in the Senate? Or, there's sort of a denial of reality here that the Democrats have always needed members like Joe Manchin to make majorities. And frankly, Joe Manchin is a heck of a lot more progressive than Democrats who used to be in the U.S. Senate and House caucuses who were Democrats. I mean, Manchin is a loyal Democrat, I think, on a lot of issues. Now, again, he's definitely not as liberal as many of his colleagues, but, that it's a 50-50 majority. So any tweak in it, and the Republicans are in charge. And so I just, people want to have a more pure party, but that almost always means a smaller party too. And so it's easy to be in the minority and to, mouth off about stuff, but not actually be exercising real power. Now, again, is it frustrating to Democrats that they can't get everything done that they want to? Yeah, it is, but they also have tiny majorities in both the House and the Senate. And an important thing to grasp just about the general, kind of opinion in the country is that, generally speaking, there are more people who self-identify as Democrats and self-identify as Republicans. That's true throughout polling for many years. It's probably less. It's less striking than it used to be, but it's like 35% call themselves Democrats, 30% call themselves Republicans, and the rest are independents. And some of those folks, as we talked about, are sort of closet partisans. But if you ask people their ideology, it is still the case that a lot more people call themselves conservative than call themselves liberal, and there's a big moderate block. And Democrats have to win by getting more. Democrats basically need more of the moderates, assuming they have essentially all the liberals, than Republicans do, just because there are more conservatives than there are liberals. So the ideological makeup of the electorate is reflected in our two parties, in that the Republicans are, I would say, more conservative than the Democrats are liberal, but they also can be because their party is made up of more, or they're just more conservatives than there are liberals, and it's just a reality of life. And I think some people get caught up and they say, oh, well, that's not fair or whatever. Well, fair's got nothing to do with it. It's about, in a two-party system, how do you find ways to get to 50% plus one in certain races, and to get to 50% plus one in majorities in the House and the Senate. And frankly, the Democrats are just more reliant on cutting into kind of more moderate and even conservative territory than Republicans are, and I think it's been that way for a long time.
Yeah. So, speaking of those moderates,
I'm my high horse about that, but I just
no, you're good.
I just part of what I think I try to do and other people in elections try to do is sort of just explain what's reality. It's not whether it's good or bad or what it should be or what it shouldn't be. It's just what is what is the status of the world? Why do things why do we have the sort of political system we do? The problem for the Democrats is that they're more reliant on moderates than Republicans are, and also the Electoral College, the Senate, and the House all have small but real Republican biases in them, and so that also plays into it. I mean, the Electoral College, the decisive states were several points to the right of the national voting. That's why Biden won by 4.5 nationally, but it was a close shave in the Electoral College. Again, if we didn't have the Electoral College, would it be better? I mean, sure, but that's not the world we live in. The median seats in the Senate by presidential performance, I think, are Georgia and North Carolina, two states that were much closer for president than the national vote was. And the median House seat is a couple points to the right of the nation, too. So that's the reality. And again, I'm not saying it's fair or unfair or whatever. That's just the reality.
Yeah, something that could bring some moderate voters in, like you were mentioning, is the January 6th hearings, which are happening right now, like that you also mentioned, and the surprise witness testimony from a former Mark Meadows rep or intern, or I don't know if she's
employee.
Employee.
We'll just cover broad term employee.
Right, yeah. But anyways, Cassidy Hutchinson, she said that she had a lot of talk about President Trump trying to grab the wheel of the car he was in, try to lead him to the Capitol. Something that actually I think she heard it from like a phone call, so I think that there's a little bit of difference on her testimony because a lot of the Secret Service agents are coming out saying that didn't happen. The projector is turned off. So I don't know what's going on there. But those hearings, for the ones that are paying attention, because you said the independent voters are typically staying out of it normally, which could be correct for the most part. I wouldn't honestly know. But do you think that these allegations and just like this media around the president and the whole operation on that day and leading up to it and everything is going to turn some, even if the economy's bad, even if whatever, nothing's going great, you think that'll turn some independents off and move them into the Democratic camp?
I don't know if it has much of an effect on the 2022 election. I do think that it's possible that Trump has taken on sort of additional baggage from this. I mean, I think reasonably speaking, I think he probably should, but again, it's not necessarily my job to say whether I think it should or what should or shouldn't happen. It's just a question as to how much control does he still exert over the Republican Party and how dominant or not dominant would he be if he decided to run for president again? And could there be some sort of legal action that comes out of this? I don't know. I mean, I guess I find it difficult to imagine a former president being, tried and convicted of a crime, even though certainly a lot of his actions in and around January 6th are things that potentially have legal repercussions. But I'm not a lawyer, and I won't pretend. I'm not going to pretend to be. But I don't. When Republicans say, "Oh well, voters care more about inflation and this or that," like I think they're right about that. Although that also doesn't mean that you shouldn't be doing the January 6th investigation, because of course it should happen. Again, setting the sort of political ramifications aside, even though it's not a top issue for a lot of voters, it was a frankly extremely dark day in American politics, in American life, and it merits investigation. But look, I mean, Republicans don't support the commission and they don't support its actions. It looks like Liz Cheney, who's the most prominent Republican on the commission, is probably going to lose her primary coming up here in August. But that doesn't mean that the work wasn't worth doing and that they haven't found a lot of things. And I mean, realistically, whether Trump should face charges or not, there's also just sort of a basic kind of normative question as to, is this person responsible enough to hold the presidency? And I think he's pretty clearly demonstrated over the course of a lot of things that he is not. The Senate had a chance to convict him in the impeachment trial, and the important thing that would have come out of that is that they then could have voted on a simple majority vote to bar him from running for office in the future. They decided not to do that, and so the specter of Trump running again still hangs over politics, even as we see all of the irresponsible things that he did, in the aftermath of the 2020 election.
Yeah, we have a couple more questions, right? And then we'll let you go. So one last thing on the congressional side, this is about the Senate actually, so the senatorial side, is Utah. Utah incumbent Senator Mike Lee, he just won his primary, although with only 62% of the votes, so not really a convincing performance. And he's up against the independent Evan McMullen, who's backed by Democrats, and he's backed by the Utah Alliance Party in the state, which is I believe it's a pretty big part of the state's local politics. There was a third-party race in Arkansas in 2020, Tom Cotton versus a libertarian. I forgot his name, but there wasn't really a chance there. But there was no Democrat in the race, so it's a little similar to that dynamic. However, in Utah, he's polling pretty well against Senator Lee. He was within 4 points in the last thing I saw. We recently did an article about him, about this race on PP Political too, so I'm going to plug that real quick if you guys want to check that out. But do you think that Evan McMullen has a real shot to unseat Mike Lee? Because the whole environment, people are getting tired of the two-party system from all the polling. Polling, take it with a grain of salt, but a lot of the polling shows a little bit of a shift happening. Do you think a conservative independent, because McMullen's, he's not a Democrat, he is a conservative. Do you think he has a real shot at unseating Lee in November?
So we wrote about this race relatively recently, and we actually changed our rating from safe Republican to likely Republican, just because we thought that the McMullen candidacy is sort of interesting in that he's running almost as like a fusion independent Democratic candidate. The Democrats obviously decided not to run anyone, and we just thought it merited a different rating than many of the other truly sleepy, safe Republican races across the Senate landscape. Now, do I think McMullen has a true, actual shot to win? Probably not. I just think at the end of the day, Utah's just too Republican of a state. But Democrats haven't run a truly competitive Senate race in that state in decades. And this one could be a little bit different in that McMullen is an actual is an independent. He's like a never Trump Republican. So I don't know. It's kind of hard to ideologically categorize those folks. Some of them remain pretty conservative on other things. Others of the never Trump conservative group have sort of moved left on other things, I think, as they've sort of kind of crossed over the Democratic camp. Certainly that's the argument that Mike Lee and his allies are going to make against McMullen. McMullen sort of feels like a moderate to me on a lot of different things. I think it's interesting. I think it's one of the more just kind of novel races of this cycle. But ultimately, I think it would still be shocking if McMullen actually won. But we'll have to see how, if we get any sort of polling indication that it truly is close. There's been sort of scattered indication that it might be. To your point about the primary, Lee got about a little over 60%. And he was weakest in Salt Lake County, which is obviously where Salt Lake City is. It's one of the few places where Democrats compete in that state, and you would need to see a pretty huge landslide, I think, for McMullen in that county to actually win. So he has to bring together both the sort of core Democratic, sort of moderate voting bloc in that county, but also attract some of the people, the Republicans who did not vote for Lee in the primary, of which there are many. You got 60, little under or over 60%. That means that a little less than 40% did vote for him. If McMullen needs to convert a lot of those folks into voting for him, which I think is a heavy lift, but there is a path. I mean, McMullen seems to think that that Romney, Mitt Romney, the other senator from that state, that his approval rating sort of breakdown is sort of is a model for what the electorate could look like. It would really be a cross-party coalition. He'd get, a big block of Republicans, big block of Democrats, and big block of independents, because that's sort of, if you look at Romney's approval, there's not huge differences among the three groups. But that's a heavy. I think it's a heavy lift, but I'm at least a little intrigued by it.
Yeah. I just want to say, I think McMullen's campaigned a lot on Mike Lee's involvement with the whole 2020 election and his initial want to not certify the. I don't know. A lot of the stuff about the 2020 election, Mike Lee is implicated in. McMullen's been campaigning hard on that, so I can see he wants to get that moderate, never Trump Republican vote for sure, and he's pretty libertarian on abortion as well. So it's gonna be interesting.
Yeah, I mean, Trump did win Utah by 20 points. It was like 57-37. But that's actually a pretty bad performance for a Republican in that state. And, of course, McMullen ran for president in 2016, and you had kind of a legitimate three-way race in Utah for president, and Trump got under 50%. So, again, there's certainly Utah is I think you could make the argument prior to Trump coming along that Utah is the most Republican state in the country. I would not say that now. I think it's probably like Wyoming is probably the most Republican state in the country. But it's certainly pretty high on the list still. But there was some erosion there because of Trump. So so there may be some persuadable Republicans who could maybe cross over with McMullen if they feel like Lee is sort of just kind of too much in the Trump camp.
And leading into that, let's just say he pulls it off. If McMullen does win, how do you think that opens the door for a 2024 independent presidential run from a popular politician or media figures such as maybe Senator Bernie Sanders or Matthew McConaughey, who got on a lot of people's radar after his speech about the Uvalde shooting in Texas? At least from what I've seen and heard a lot, he's been on a lot of people's radar, and a lot of people are looking into his, I guess you can say, political takes and atmosphere.
I'd personally probably vote for him because there was a poll. Well, sorry to interrupt, but there was that 58% of Americans would back a third-party candidate if Trump or Biden were the nominees for either party. That came out from The Hill a couple months ago. So that's just like a little preface to the reason for our question, really.
I just don't think that there is a huge national constituency really for a third-party candidate. And, look, in 2016, you had Trump and Clinton running. They both had horrible favorability numbers. You did have, a credible third-party option in Gary Johnson, who was a libertarian candidate. Ultimately, only 6% of the electorate voted for someone other than Clinton and Trump. And I just feel like ultimately people come home to the two major parties. They feel like the independent candidates don't have a chance to win. And so I just don't, as much as people may say they want a third-party candidate, I don't know if it actually translates into a voting block when you have two major party options, as you will in 2024. I think that back during this is ancient history at this time, or at this point, but when Lincoln ran for re-election in 1864, he was not technically the Republican Party nominee. There was the Union Party that emerged as sort of a kind of a catch-all, and it was, I guess you could kind of say it was like a rebranded Republican Party, but I think it was kind of this national unity party or something. And you wonder if at some point if there's some sort of, I don't know. And I kind of thought that maybe 2016 would have been the time to do this, but it just wasn't going to happen, and Clinton would have been the totally wrong person to do it anyway. But that you could almost see a kind of a third party sort of rise up and sort of co-opt one of the two major parties, and then they would create kind of like this unity ticket as a way to defeat someone from the other side that was seen as unpalatable or something. I don't know if we have the capacity really to do that in American politics, but I sometimes think about it because there may be some election in the future where that is where that would be a reasonable thing to do. But again, I don't think that if you've got a Democrat and Republican running, I think it's really hard for an independent to actually get the traction that he or she would need to really compete. I mean, even Ross Perot was really prominent, spent a lot of money. He got 19% in 1992, although he didn't win any electoral votes. That's also part of the problem, is that it's so hard for a third-party candidate to actually win electoral votes.
Yeah, well, Ross Perot did drop out, right? I think he dropped out and then he came back into the race.
He dropped out and came back in. He also ran in 96, got much less of the vote, but I think it was high single digits in 96. there's a lot of feeling that Bush got robbed of the election because Perot ran in '92. Most people seem to think that's not actually the case. That Clinton would have beaten Bush heads up, or 1-on-1. But yeah, I just don't see ultimately see the constituency for it if in fact there is a Democratic and a Republican nominee.
Yeah. So that's about it. We know you're a busy man, so we'll let you go. Andrew, do you have any questions? Ready? Nothing? All right. You sure?
Yeah.
All right. Well, Kyle Kondik, thank you for joining us. Where can the listeners find you and your work?
So I'm on Twitter at kkondik, and I am managing editor of Sabato's Crystal Ball, centerforpolitics.org/Crystal Ball, and you can sign up for our newsletter. We come out usually twice a week, and it is free. So sign up if you're interested in this stuff.
Yeah, we'll put descriptions or links in all for his book, for the Center for Politics, Twitter, all of that in the description. You guys know where to find us. We're not going to go through the spiel again. Last time it was like 2 minutes long, so we're not going to do that again. Thank you guys for listening. I'm your Sean Pokerell.
My name's Cameron Cummings.
And goodbye.